He caught his maid crying in the rain. But what she said next made the richest man in New York question everything. Hello everyone. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. Rain swallowed the lights of New York that night. The Whitmore estate, marble, glass, and arrogance, stood high above the city like a fortress watching over everything it owned. But even walls that thick couldn't keep the storm out. It came in waves, drumming against the roof, spilling over the balconies, and flooding the gardens in sheets of restless silver. Ethan Whitmore adjusted the collar of his coat as he stepped out of the main hall. The echo of his assistant's voice still rang in his ear from the late-night call, mergers, stocks, deadlines. Everything that mattered in his world came with numbers and signatures. Feelings were for the poor. Lightning cracked across the sky, painting the estate in brief, violent light. That's when he saw it. A shape, small, unmoving, hunched beside the servants' quarters at the edge of the courtyard. At first, Ethan thought it was a shadow, or maybe an animal seeking shelter. But as his eyes adjusted through the storm, the shape took form. A woman, his maid. Amara Johnson sat in the mud, apron plastered to her skin, her hair slicked flat against her face. Her bare feet were half buried in puddles, her hands covering her face. The storm beat down on her shoulders like punishment, but she didn't move. She didn't even flinch. Something sharp twisted in Ethan's chest, irritation, maybe, or something he didn't have a word for. He strode forward, his voice cutting through the rain. Amara. No response. Amara, what the hell are you doing out here? She startled, eyes wide, as though caught stealing air itself. Her lips trembled before the words came out, thin and cracked. I didn't want to cry inside, sir. I didn't want anyone to see. For a long moment, Ethan didn't speak. The rain filled the silence between them, relentless, pounding, cleansing. He had seen employees cry before. Assistants, interns, even executives. But never like this, not with such quiet surrender, as though she had accepted that no one in this world cared enough to ask why. He should have turned around. He should have told her to get back to work, to act like the professional he paid her to be. That's what the old Ethan Whitmore would have done, the one who never let a moment of softness cost him his edge. Instead, he stood there in the rain, watching her wipe her face with trembling hands. The sight made his throat tighten with a guilt he didn't understand. You're drenched, he said, the edge in his voice dulling. You'll make yourself sick. I'm fine, sir, she whispered. It's not the first time. Her words landed like a bruise. Not the first time. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the mansion, warm lights glowing through glass, music still faintly echoing from the dining hall. Inside, his world went on. Laughter, champagne, comfort. Out here, his maid sat alone in the rain because she didn't think she belonged in the same air as them. He clenched his jaw. Get inside. Now. Amara hesitated, as if weighing whether she had the right to obey. Then she rose slowly, mud sliding from her skirt, and walked past him toward the servant's door. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. Only her quiet steps and the soft hitch of her breath followed her. Ethan stood there long after she was gone, rain soaking through his clothes. For the first time in a long time, the storm didn't feel like noise. It felt like judgment. He turned his face to the sky, water streaming down his cheeks. What the hell just happened to me? He thought. Why do I care? Lightning flashed again, and for an instant, he saw her face in his mind. The pain behind her composure. The kind of sadness that didn't come from spilled tea or broken rules, but from something much deeper. He didn't know it yet, but that image would haunt him. Because the storm that had drenched the Whitmore estate that night had done more than flood the marble paths. It had cracked open the heart of a man who thought he no longer had one. 2 days earlier, the Whitmore estate had been glowing with luxury. A long table stretched across the grand dining room, set with imported crystal and silver so polished it reflected the chandelier's light like fire. Laughter floated over the hum of jazz. Wealth, power, and pride filled the air thicker than perfume. At the far end of the room sat Ethan Whitmore, perfectly tailored, discussing mergers with two international investors. To him, this wasn't dinner, it was war dressed in elegance. Every word mattered. Every smile was calculated. And among the waitstaff moving quietly between chairs and conversation, barely noticed by anyone, was Amara Johnson. She'd been with the Whitmores for nearly a year, long enough to know the rhythm of the mansion, the hierarchy of voices. Staff didn't speak unless spoken to. Mistakes weren't forgiven, they were remembered. She carried a silver tray with practiced care, eyes lowered, her posture straight despite the fatigue that ached in her shoulders. The storm outside hadn't begun yet, but she could feel one brewing in her chest, the kind that had nothing to do with weather. She reached Mr. Caldwell, one of Ethan's oldest investors, and leaned carefully to serve his tea. But the room's laughter startled her. A joke at the table, sharp and sudden, and her wrist jerked slightly. The teacup tipped. A stream of amber liquid spilled across Mr. Caldwell's custom-tailored sleeve. A silence followed so abrupt it made the chandeliers seem to stop their sway. Amara gasped softly, retreating half a step. "I'm so sorry, sir, I'll—" But before she could finish, Ethan's voice cut through the air. "Clean it up," he said flatly, eyes still on his investor. No anger, no empathy, just that crisp indifference he'd perfected over years of being obeyed. Mr. Caldwell forced a laugh, waving a hand. "No harm done, Whitmore. It's just tea." Laughter resumed, thin and artificial. But Amara could feel the eyes of the other staff on her. Silent judgment, quiet pity. She knelt to wipe the spill, her cheeks burning hotter than the tea itself. That moment lasted less than a minute. But by morning, the whispers had already begun. In the servants' quarters, gossip spread faster than steam. "She spilled tea on Mr. Caldwell. Can you imagine? They say the butler's writing a report. She won't last till Friday." Amara said nothing. She simply tied her apron tighter and kept moving, polishing floors, folding linens, and forcing her trembling hands to stay steady. She wasn't just working for herself. Her mother's hospital bills were due in 2 days, and every paycheck counted. Losing this job wasn't an option. Crying wasn't either. Meanwhile, Ethan barely remembered the incident. For him, it was a trivial disruption in an evening of negotiations. The kind of thing money erased. But something about the silence in the mansion that morning felt heavier than usual. The hush of people who feared consequences. In his study, the butler, Mr. Gregson, stepped in carrying a clipboard. "The staff report from last night, sir," he said smoothly. "I've noted a minor infraction from one of the maids. Spilled a drink during service." Ethan didn't even look up from his laptop. "Handle it." Gregson's lips curved. Of course. By evening, the atmosphere in the servants' wing had turned icy. Tasks were doubled. Shifts lengthened. And every time Amara entered a room, the conversation died mid-sentence. She smiled politely anyway, as if courtesy could disguise humiliation. Later that night, when she returned to her small attic room, she found a folded piece of paper under her door and signed. "You embarrassed him. People like you always do. Stay quiet and pray he forgets." She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the words until they blurred. Then she pressed her palms against her eyes and whispered to herself, "You can't break now. You can't." But the tears came anyway, quiet, angry, helpless, the kind she would later hide in the rain. Across the mansion, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city lights. He didn't know why his mind kept circling back to that moment. The spill, her trembling hands, the way she apologized as if she'd committed a crime. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just another servant afraid of losing her job. But deep down, beneath the armor of control, something small and unfamiliar stirred. A flicker of awareness he'd long trained himself to ignore. He poured himself another drink, dismissing the thought. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The storm was coming, and neither of them knew how much it would wash away. Morning came dressed in gray. The storm clouds still lingered over Manhattan, their weight pressing against the glass walls of the Whitmore estate. Inside, everything gleamed as it always did. Silver trays polished to perfection, marble floors shining beneath quiet footsteps. Yet something in the air had shifted. Whispers drifted through the halls like smoke. In the servants' quarters, the maids spoke in hushed tones between chores, their glances darting toward Amara's closed door. In the main house, Gregson's presence seemed heavier than usual, his expression carved in authority. And in the heart of it all, Ethan Whitmore sat in his study, reviewing reports, trying, and failing, to ignore the unease building in his chest. He had not seen Amara since the night she cried in the rain. And yet, that image still haunted him, the small figure trembling beneath the downpour, her voice breaking as she said she didn't belong inside. He had meant to check on her. He hadn't. Instead, he buried himself in contracts, meetings, and strategy calls, anything that felt predictable. But some storms don't fade with sleep. They wait. By late afternoon, the rhythm of the day was broken by a knock on the door. Ethan looked up from his laptop. "Come in." Gregson entered, posture straight, tone grave. "Sir, I'm afraid there's a matter requiring your attention." Ethan's brows drew together. "Go on." "It concerns one of the maids," Gregson said, lowering a folder onto the desk. "Amara Johnson. We have reason to believe she's been stealing food from the kitchen." The words landed like a thud in the quiet room. Ethan leaned back slowly, expression unreadable. "Stealing," he repeated. "Yes, sir. One of the kitchen staff reported missing items last week. Prepared meals, desserts, occasionally leftovers meant for disposal. At first, I assumed it was simple miscounting. But last night, the security cameras caught someone leaving the rear exit after hours." Gregson opened the folder. Inside lay a single grainy still from the security feed, a figure in uniform, holding a covered dish close to her chest, heading toward the back gate. Amara. Ethan studied the photo. The image was blurry, distorted by motion and dim light, but there was no mistaking her. The outline of her frame, the curve of her hair beneath her cap. She said she didn't want to cry where anyone could see her. He murmured under his breath, almost to himself. Gregson blinked. "Sir." Ethan shook his head slightly. "Nothing. Continue." Gregson's voice dropped into that professional tone Ethan despised. Calm, sterile, like a man delivering bad news he secretly enjoyed. "Theft is theft, sir, regardless of the reason. Shall I prepare the dismissal notice?" Ethan exhaled slowly, setting the photo down. "Do we know why?" "Why, sir?" "Yes," he said sharply. "Why would she steal food when she's paid and fed here?" Gregson's lips tightened. "With respect, sir, people like her often have attachments outside of work. Family, perhaps. They tend to share what isn't theirs. It's a matter of upbringing." The way he said people like her grated against Ethan's nerves. He didn't know why it bothered him. It never had before. But this time, it sounded like something rotten. He turned the photo again, staring at it until the lines blurred. She's quiet, he thought. Careful. Frightened maybe, but not careless. Still, he said nothing of his doubt. He was a man who dealt in facts, and the fact was, she'd been caught on camera. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled. "Handle it quietly. She's dismissed first thing in the morning." Gregson nodded, pleased. "Understood, sir." As the butler left the study, the door clicked shut, soft, final. Ethan sat there for a long time, staring at the photo in front of him. Rain began again outside, light and rhythmic against the glass. He couldn't shake the thought that something about this didn't fit, that maybe, just maybe, he was firing someone not because of her guilt, but because it was easier than facing his own discomfort. He told himself it didn't matter. It always mattered. At dawn, Gregson returned to the servants' wing to deliver the news. The corridor was silent, empty. When he reached Amara's small attic room, the door stood ajar. The bed was neatly made, her apron folded at its foot, and on the pillow lay a single envelope, sealed with careful handwriting. Gregson frowned, picked it up, and turned it over. 2 words were written on the front, for Mr. Whitmore. Ethan was halfway through a call when Gregson entered without knocking. "She's gone, sir," he said curtly. Ethan looked up. "Gone? Her things are gone. She left this behind." Gregson set the envelope on the desk. Ethan dismissed his call without a word. He broke the seal and unfolded the note slowly. The handwriting was small, neat, deliberate, the kind of script that tried not to take up too much space. Please tell Mr. Whitmore I wasn't stealing. My mother's sick. The food was for her. I didn't know what else to do." The words blurred as his eyes lingered on them. Gregson spoke again, hesitant. "I'll arrange to clear her records." Ethan raised a hand. "Leave." The door closed. Silence swallowed the room. Ethan stared at the note, every word cutting deeper than he expected. He remembered her face in the rain, the way she'd said she didn't belong inside, as if she'd already known her place in the world was temporary. He set the letter down carefully, his hand trembling just enough for him to notice. Outside, thunder rolled again, not the violent crash of a storm, but the low, distant warning of something still coming. For the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore, billionaire, CEO, master of control, felt powerless. The city had turned gray again. All morning, Ethan couldn't focus. The sound of rain against the glass office tower was relentless, soft, but accusing, like the echo of a choice he wished he could undo. He'd reread Amara's note 3 times before locking it in his desk drawer, but it didn't silence the words that kept replaying in his mind. My mother's sick. The food was for her. I didn't know what else to do. He should have asked questions. He should have listened. But he hadn't, because it was easier not to. That realization burned through him like acid. By noon, the rain had strengthened into a storm again, streaking the skyline in silver and fog. Ethan's assistant poked her head into the office. "Sir, the driver's ready for your meeting uptown." Ethan looked out the window instead. Somewhere out there, Amara was walking these same streets, probably drenched, probably scared. He had the means to find her, and for once, he couldn't stand not knowing. He turned from the window. "Cancel everything," he said. "Tell Peter to get the car." An hour later, the Bentley rolled slowly through the south end of the city, a world far from marble floors and curated silence. Streets crowded with puddles. Old brick buildings leaning under the weight of years. People huddled beneath bridges, beneath tarps, beneath indifference. Ethan sat forward, tension coiled tight in his jaw. "Check that side," he said to the driver, eyes scanning through the blur of rain. Anyone matching her description. He didn't know what he'd say if he found her. He just knew he couldn't go back to the mansion with that note echoing in his chest like an unanswered question. They drove for nearly an hour before the driver slowed. "Sir, over there." Ethan followed the man's gaze, and his heart stilled. Beneath an overpass, shielded only by the crumbling concrete above, sat Amara Johnson. Her uniform clung to her skin, hair plastered to her forehead. Beside her lay an older woman, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, coughing weakly. Amara held a small tin of soup in her hands, half-eaten, rain splattering into it, shielding her mother from the worst of the downpour with her own coat. For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. He just watched. The billionaire, the empire builder, the man used to controlling every outcome, suddenly felt like a stranger in his own life. He stepped out of the car, the rain instantly soaking through his coat. His polished shoes sank into the mud as he approached. "Amara," he said softly. Her head snapped up. Shock crossed her face, followed by something colder, harder. "Mr. Whitmore?" she whispered, disbelief cutting through her exhaustion. "Why are you here?" He swallowed, the sound lost in the rain. "You could have asked for help." She laughed bitterly, the kind of laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "People like me don't ask men like you for anything." Her words cut deeper than any accusation. Ethan looked at the woman beside her, frail, coughing, skin pale with illness. "This is your mother?" Amara nodded, eyes glistening. "She hasn't eaten properly in days." "I didn't steal, sir. I was just trying to keep her alive." For a long second, Ethan couldn't speak. The storm thudded around them, filling the silence with its merciless rhythm. He took a step closer. "You shouldn't be here. Either of you." Amara's voice trembled. "We've been here before. It's not the first time." That phrase, the same one she'd used that night in the rain, hit him like lightning. Ethan turned back toward the car. "Get the door," he told the driver. Amara shook her head instantly. "No, we don't need your pity." He met her eyes, steady, rain dripping from his hair. "It's not pity," he said. "It's my responsibility." She froze, uncertain how to respond. He crouched beside her mother, his expensive suit streaked with mud, and lifted the frail woman gently into his arms. Amara's protest faltered into silence. She stared as he carried her mother to the car, every movement deliberate, almost reverent. When he turned back, he said only 2 words, quiet but firm. "Get in." Amara hesitated, trembling. Then, slowly, she followed. The driver shut the door, and the car pulled away from the curb, tires slicing through the flooded street. Inside, the sound of the rain against the glass softened, no longer cruel, just constant. Ethan sat across from Amara, watching her hold her mother's hand, whispering soft prayers under her breath. He realized he'd never seen anyone pray before, not really. Not like this. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of every name, every face, every person whose struggle he had never stopped long enough to notice. When they reached the private hospital, nurses rushed to meet them. Ethan gave his name, and suddenly the world moved. Rooms opened, machines beeped, care appeared. Amara stood frozen as her mother was wheeled away. Ethan stayed beside her, silent. When the nurses disappeared down the hallway, she turned to him, eyes red, voice breaking. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Whitmore? You already fired me. You don't owe me anything." He looked at her, rain still dripping from his hair, his voice low and steady. "I'm not doing this because I owe you," he said. "I'm doing it because I was blind. And I'm done being that man." They stood there in the fluorescent glow of the hospital corridor, 2 worlds colliding under the hum of machines and the fading echo of the rain outside. And though neither of them knew it yet, that moment, that quiet surrender between power and humility, would become the beginning of everything. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the city wrapped in mist. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to everything. The streets still slick with rain, the air thick with silence. Inside the private hospital, the world seemed carved from glass and light. Machines hummed softly. Nurses whispered as they moved down the hallways, white shoes squeaking faintly against polished floors. It was a place Ethan Whitmore rarely entered, not because he couldn't, but because he never needed to. He sat outside room 312, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands. Through the glass panel, he could see Amara sitting by her mother's bedside, her posture rigid from exhaustion, her fingers gently stroking the older woman's hand. No one had told her to stay. She simply refused to leave. Ethan hadn't gone home since the night before. His driver had brought him a change of clothes, and his phone kept buzzing with calls from his board. But for once, he didn't care. All that mattered was inside that room. The nurse came out carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Whitmore?" Ethan stood quickly. "Yes. How is she?" "She's stable," the nurse said. "Malnutrition, untreated infection, and pneumonia. But she's responding to the antibiotics. Your intervention came just in time." Ethan nodded, though the words didn't feel like praise. They felt like an indictment, a reminder that if he'd looked sooner, cared sooner, maybe Amara wouldn't have been out in the rain at all. Through the glass, he saw Amara turn, her eyes meeting him for a moment before she quickly looked away. The distance between them felt heavier than the storm had. A few hours later, when the nurses changed shifts, Ethan walked into the room quietly. Amara looked up, startled, then lowered her gaze again. He set a paper bag on the side table. "I brought you breakfast," he said simply. She blinked, as if the words didn't register. "You what?" He gave a small, awkward shrug. "It's not much. Just coffee and some muffins. You haven't eaten since last night." Amara's lips parted slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, voice soft but edged with suspicion. Ethan hesitated. "Because I was wrong," he said finally. "And because I don't want to be the kind of man who looks away anymore." For a long time, she said nothing. The rhythmic beeping of her mother's heart monitor filled the silence. Then, slowly, Amara reached for the coffee. "Thank you," she whispered. That small moment, that simple exchange, was the first thread of something fragile and real between them. Over the next few days, Ethan returned to the hospital daily. He brought fresh clothes for Amara, paid for her mother's prescriptions, and stayed through the long hours of waiting. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. But the silence began to change. It wasn't full of blame anymore, just understanding. One evening, As the city lights shimmered through the hospital windows, Amara finally said, "You don't have to keep doing this. People will talk." Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Let them." "But why?" she pressed gently. He turned toward the window. "Because for years, I thought success was about control. But now, I'm realizing it's about responsibility. About the lives that exist in the shadow of mine." Amara studied him quietly. This man who had once seemed carved from stone now sitting beside her with his sleeves rolled up, his voice unguarded. "You sound like someone trying to make up for something," she said. Ethan exhaled. "Maybe I am." That night, when Amara's mother stirred awake for the first time, her faint voice rasped through the quiet room. "Who's that?" she asked weakly, eyes landing on Ethan. Amara hesitated, then said softly, "That's my boss, Mama. He helped us." Her mother's thin hand lifted slightly toward him. "Then God bless you, son," she murmured before drifting back to sleep. Ethan stood there, completely still, feeling something shift deep inside him, something he couldn't quite name. Later, when he left the hospital, the city had gone still. The rain clouds had cleared, and for the first time in a long time, the stars were visible above Manhattan. As his car pulled away from the curb, Ethan looked out at the night, and for once, he didn't feel like the man who owned everything. He felt like the man who had finally begun to see. The mansion felt different now. It was subtle at first, the quiet pause in the servants' conversations when Ethan entered, the way the house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see who he would be today. Even Gregson, the butler who'd served his family for decades, had started to watch him with the wary politeness reserved for unpredictable men. Ethan had returned from the hospital changed, not visibly, but in presence. His silence had weight. His eyes seemed to search corners of the estate he'd never noticed before, the scuffed edges of the servants' corridor, the broken light above the laundry room, the fatigue in the faces of the staff who worked from dawn to midnight. He saw it all now, because Amara had shown him how to look. At breakfast, the staff lined up as usual, their uniforms crisp, their smiles practiced. Gregson read the morning announcements in his clipped British tone. "Mrs. Barlow will oversee dinner service for tomorrow's investor reception. Johnson's position remains unfilled pending replacement interviews." Ethan paused mid-sip of his coffee. "That won't be necessary." Gregson blinked. "Sir, Amara Johnson's position," Ethan clarified. "It's not vacant. She'll return when her mother's recovered." Gregson's jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, her conduct." "Her conduct," Ethan interrupted, his tone firm, "was the only honest act anyone in this house has shown in months." A heavy silence followed. The staff glanced at one another, unsure whether to be afraid or relieved. Ethan set his cup down with deliberate calm. "Effective immediately," he said, "every member of household staff is to be registered under a new benefits plan, medical, dental, housing stipends. I'll handle the paperwork through Whitmore Tech's HR department." Gregson's face paled. "That's unprecedented, sir." "The cost will come out of my own account," Ethan finished. "Consider it an investment in the people who make this house feel human." The butler swallowed hard. "If I may, sir, charity can breed dependency." Ethan's gaze sharpened, steel beneath restraint. "Then it's time they depended on someone who actually gives a damn." That afternoon, Ethan's words began to ripple through his company. At Whitmore Tech headquarters, executives were startled to receive a sudden internal memo, short, decisive, and signed personally by Ethan Whitmore. "Effective immediately, initiate a review of all employee wellness and compensation programs. Focus on custodial, cafeteria, and maintenance departments. Expect oversight." The HR director read it twice before muttering, "This can't be right." But it was. For the first time in his career, Ethan wasn't chasing profit margins or market growth. He was chasing something that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. Later that evening, he visited the hospital again. Amara met him in the hallway, her mother sleeping peacefully behind the curtain. "You look tired," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "I've had a busy day." "Work?" He nodded. "Change?" Amara tilted her head. "Change?" Ethan hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I started something today. A benefits program for all my employees. including domestic staff. Your story made me realize how easy it is to ignore the people who keep your world standing. Amara's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of disbelief. You did that because of me? He met her gaze evenly. Because of what you showed me. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Amara looked down, her fingers tightening around the edge of her mother's blanket. You're different now, she murmured. Maybe, Ethan said. Or maybe I'm just finally human. But as word of Ethan's reform spread, so did resistance. By the end of the week, Gregson was on the phone late at night, whispering into the receiver in his private quarters. Yes, he said quietly. He's changing things. No, not minor things. The entire structure. He paused, listening. Yes, sir. I'll handle it. He hung up and exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing toward the staircase that led to Ethan's study. Meanwhile, Ethan stood on his balcony, watching the city lights shimmer against the horizon. The wind carried the faint smell of rain again, not a storm this time, but something waiting to return. He thought of Amara's words in the hospital. You're different now. Maybe she was right. Maybe the man who once ruled from marble towers had finally stepped into the storm for good. But even as he stood there, feeling lighter than he had in years, a shadow was already forming behind him, one that would soon test everything he'd begun to build. The news broke before dawn. Ethan woke to the sound of his phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. The screen was lit with dozens of missed calls, from his publicist, from board members, from numbers he didn't recognize. He sat up, brows furrowed, and opened the first message. It was a photo, grainy, taken through the rain. Ethan Whitmore, billionaire CEO, carrying an unknown black woman's mother into a hospital at midnight. The caption below was worse. Whitmore's secret scandal. Billionaire's midnight rescue of his maid's family sparks speculation. Within minutes, the story had spread across every platform. Talk shows dissected it. Twitter boiled. News anchors smiled through polished teeth as they debated whether compassion was code for impropriety. By breakfast, stock prices had begun to dip. In the Whitmore mansion, chaos ruled. PR advisors paced the hallways with tablets and coffee cups. Lawyers argued about statements. Gregson moved quietly through the commotion, his eyes sharp, his posture dignified and unreadable. Ethan stood in his study, staring out the rain-streaked window, the skyline distant behind gray clouds. Sir, said his head of communications, voice taut, we need to issue a denial immediately. Say it was charity, humanitarian work. Distance yourself. Ethan didn't turn. From who? From her, the man said carefully. From this Maid. That word, Maid, struck something deep and old in Ethan's chest. He turned at last, his eyes cold but steady. Her name is Amara Johnson, he said, and I won't erase her to make anyone comfortable. The room fell silent. Another advisor spoke up nervously. Sir, investors are panicking. The board is already talking about a no-confidence vote. You need to. Enough. Ethan cut in, his voice a controlled storm. If they want to fire me for doing the right thing, let them. Later that day, as the rain began to fall again, almost poetically, Ethan stood before a mirror in his penthouse office. He straightened his tie, wiped the fatigue from his face, and made a decision that would change everything. He called a press conference. The room filled with reporters, cameras, and flashing lights. The air buzzed with questions, rumors, and judgment. Ethan stepped up to the podium. No entourage, no teleprompter, no pre-approved statement. He looked directly into the cameras, the weight of the world pressing down on him, and began. You've all seen the photo, he said calmly. You've all read the headlines. But let me tell you what you haven't seen. He paused, scanning the sea of faces. You haven't seen a daughter who worked 16-hour days to feed her sick mother. You haven't seen a system that lets the people who clean our homes go hungry while we dine on gold. You haven't seen how blind I was, until the night I found her crying in the rain. A murmur swept through the room. Ethan continued, voice deep and unwavering. Her name is Amara Johnson. She's not my scandal. She's my mirror. And if seeing her pain offends you, then maybe we've forgotten what humanity looks like. The silence that followed was electric. Cameras clicked like thunder. He stepped back from the podium, his last words echoing, "I'm not ashamed of compassion. I'm ashamed it took me this long to feel it." The press erupted. The story went viral overnight, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Clips of Ethan's speech flooded social media, captioned with phrases like #HumanBeforeBillionaire and #AmaraJohnson. People shared their own stories of mistreatment and invisibility. Within 24 hours, Whitmore Tech's public image began to shift from scandal to symbol. But inside the mansion, not everyone celebrated. That evening, Gregson approached Ethan in the dim hallway, expression unreadable. "Sir," he said stiffly, "the board is furious. They say you've humiliated the company. They're calling an emergency session tomorrow." Ethan nodded slowly. "Let them. I'm done serving people who measure decency by profit margins." Gregson's lips tightened. "You're destroying everything your father built." Ethan met his gaze, calm and cold. "No," he said softly. "I'm rebuilding what he forgot." Gregson hesitated, then inclined his head slightly, but the look in his eyes was dangerous. When he left the room, Ethan knew the next battle wouldn't be fought in headlines, but in the shadows of his own empire. Hours later, Ethan stood on the balcony again, the rain drizzling lightly. Down below, New York shimmered like wet glass, 1,000 lights reflected in 1,000 puddles. His phone buzzed once more, a message from an unknown number. It was a single sentence. "You've made powerful enemies, Mr. Whitmore. Be careful who you trust." Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment before turning it off and slipping it into his pocket. He looked out at the city, the storm's whisper all around him. "Let them come," he murmured. "I've weathered worse." Beautiful choice. This is where the emotional payoff begins. The world didn't forget overnight, but it began to listen. In the weeks that followed Ethan's speech, the Whitmore name took on a new meaning. News outlets that had once mocked him now replayed his words in montage reels. Journalists called it the billionaire's awakening. But behind the headlines and hashtags, the real change wasn't happening in boardrooms or stock markets. It was happening in the quiet corners of Whitmore Tech, in the cafeteria where employees now ate free meals for the first time, in the janitorial wing where new lockers and showers replaced rusted ones, in the employee lounge where laughter began to replace silence. And at the center of it all was one man who no longer hid behind glass towers. It started with a single phone call. "Mr. Whitmore," his HR director said carefully, "the foundation launch proposal is ready for your approval." Ethan leaned back in his office chair, eyes fixed on the framed photo that now hung behind his desk, a picture of Amara in the rain, her head held high. He'd insisted that image be the emblem of the Whitmore Foundation for Workers' Dignity, the charity arm of his company. "Send it to Amara first," Ethan said. The director hesitated. "Amara Johnson?" "Yes," he said simply. "She's the foundation's new director of staff relations." There was a stunned silence on the line. Then, "Of course, sir." A week later, the foundation's headquarters opened in the heart of Manhattan, a renovated industrial space filled with sunlight and greenery. The air was alive with hope, nerves, and the faint hum of possibility. Amara stood at the podium, microphone trembling slightly in her hands. Dozens of cameras and employees watched as she took a deep breath. "I don't know how to speak like CEOs do," she began, her voice steadying with every word. "But I know what it's like to feel unseen, to work hard and still go hungry, to be afraid to ask for help." She paused, glancing toward the front row, where Ethan sat, his expression calm, proud, and humbled all at once. "This foundation isn't about charity," she continued. "It's about dignity, about making sure no one else has to cry in the rain to be noticed." The audience erupted into applause. When the cameras turned away, Ethan stepped up to her side, lowering his voice. "You did beautifully." Amara looked up at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You mean we did?" He shook his head softly. "No, Amara. You were the spark. I just followed the light." Over the next few months, the world began to shift around them. Ethan worked tirelessly, funding educational programs, housing projects, and health care for low-income workers. For the first time, he didn't measure success in dollars, but in lives changed. And through it all, Amara became his quiet anchor, not as an employee, but as an equal, a partner in purpose. Some nights, they worked late into the evening, reviewing proposals by lamplight. Their hands brushed when passing papers, their laughter filling spaces once ruled by silence. But the moment that would define them came one rainy evening in October. The sky was a dull silver, rain whispering against the glass of the foundation's top-floor windows. Ethan stood alone by the balcony, watching the city glow beneath the storm. He heard the door open behind him, soft footsteps, familiar now. "Still working?" Amara asked gently. He smiled faintly without turning. Trying not to. She joined him by the railing, holding an umbrella. The rain misted through the air, cool and light. "You know," she said softly, "it's raining again." He glanced at her, then out at the city. "Seems it always does when something important happens." Amara's eyes glistened, reflecting the gray sky. "Do you remember that night? When you found me crying?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not from shame, but from the ache of memory. "I remember thinking you were the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever seen." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her fully then, the woman who'd changed him without ever asking for anything. "Now I think you're the most beautiful thing I've ever known." The rain softened, falling in delicate strings of silver light. Amara held his gaze for a long moment before whispering, "You didn't find your heart, Ethan. You just stopped hiding it." He smiled, quiet, genuine, and entirely human. Together, they stood under the umbrella, watching the city glimmer through the storm. Two souls, one born from privilege, one from pain, finally standing on the same side of the rain. Years later, the storm had long passed, but its sound still lived somewhere in Ethan Whitmore's memory. Sometimes, when rain brushed against his office windows, he would pause mid-meeting, his pen stilled above the page. He'd close his eyes and remember that night. A courtyard drenched in silver, a trembling girl with her face in her hands, and the way one sentence had changed everything he thought he knew about the world. "I didn't want to cry inside, sir. I didn't want anyone to see." It was strange how a single moment could divide a life into before and after. The Whitmore Foundation had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. What began as a scandal control initiative had become a global movement. Hospitals, scholarship programs, housing for displaced workers, mentorships for single mothers, and community centers in cities that had once worshipped his skyscrapers. But Ethan no longer lived in glass towers. He preferred his small office in the Foundation's Manhattan building, the same one Amara had designed herself, filled with plants, open windows, and the faint scent of rainwater and jasmine. She was the heart of it all now. Amara Whitmore Johnson, Executive Director. The name still made him smile every time he saw it engraved on the brass plaque outside her door. On a quiet afternoon, a journalist arrived to interview him for a feature titled The Turning Point, the billionaire who changed his world. The reporter, a young man with a notepad and nervous energy, cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore, you've donated billions. You've rebuilt entire communities. But if you had to name the moment that changed your life, what would it be?" Ethan leaned back, eyes distant, voice low but sure. "One night," he said slowly, "I caught my maid crying in the rain." The reporter hesitated, pen hovering. "That was the turning point." Ethan nodded. "Yes, because that night, I realized something money had blinded me to all my life. Wealth means nothing if you can't make someone feel safe beneath it." The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the rain against the glass. The reporter looked up, visibly moved. "That's powerful, sir." Ethan smiled faintly. "It's not power. It's empathy. The storm that washes power clean." When the interview ended, Ethan walked down the hallway to the photo gallery. Each wall was lined with black and white portraits. Workers, nurses, teachers, janitors, all smiling, all proud. But at the center of it hung the photo that started it all. Amara, standing in the rain, her chin lifted toward the sky. Beneath the frame, in neat silver script, the quote he had chosen years ago read, "Empathy is the storm that washes power clean." That evening, Amara joined him by the window of his office. The city outside shimmered beneath a light drizzle. She carried 2 cups of tea, setting one beside him. "Still thinking about the old days?" she teased softly. Ethan smiled, his reflection flickering in the rain-streaked glass. Always. But the difference is, back then, I thought the rain was just weather. She laughed quietly, her hand brushing his. And now, he said, turning toward her, I know it was mercy. Amara leaned her head on his shoulder. Together, they watched the city through the mist, no longer master and servant, not savior and saved, but two people who had learned to see each other through the storm. The rain fell harder outside, echoing that long-ago night. But inside, there was only warmth, light, and the quiet rhythm of two hearts that had finally come home. Long after Ethan Whitmore's name faded from the business magazines, the Whitmore Foundation continued to thrive, guided by Amara's steady compassion and his legacy of reform. New generations grew up under its programs, children of workers becoming leaders, dreamers, and builders of a gentler world. And on a marble plaque outside the main hall, engraved beneath the foundation's emblem, stood the words that had defined their story. It began with a storm, but it ended with a heart that finally learned to feel.
Thank you so much for staying down to the end. I am sure you enjoyed this story to the very end. Please do well to subscribe to my channel and enjoy more of this awesome stories. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.